go over our factoring exercises. So what we're going to do is we're going to factor the following completely. Now when you factor completely, you need to make sure that you have factored everything that can possibly be factored. So the first thing you want to do always is start off by factoring out the greatest common factor, if there is one. There isn't always going to be one, but if there is one, you definitely want to try to do and pull that out first. Then you look at what's left. Is it 4 terms? And so then you may want to try factoring by grouping. Is it 3 terms? Then you want to try one of the methods of trinomials. Is it 2 terms? Is it the difference of 2 perfect squares? And every time you factor, you look at each of your new factors and you ask yourself those same things. Can I factor by grouping? Is it a trinomial? Is it the difference of 2 perfect squares? And you continue to do this until you answer no to all the questions. So let's look at our first example. 2x cubed minus 4x squared minus 30x. Always the first thing you want to do is factor out the greatest common factor. Does 2x cubed, 4x squared, and 30x have anything in common? If so, pull it out. And it has a 2x. So remember, when you're factoring, it's the same thing as dividing, right? So when I take this 2x out, I'm dividing the 2x cubed by 2x, which leaves me x squared. This 4x by 2x, which gives me a 2x. And this 30x by 2x, which gives me 15. And now what I have left right here is a trinomial where the leading coefficient is a 1. So if this factors, it'll factor into 2 groups of 2, an x here and an x here. And I just have to ask myself what 2 numbers multiply to get negative 15 that add to negative 2, and that would be negative 5 and positive 3. So this will factor into 2x times x minus 5 times x plus 3. Now when you factor completely, you can always go back and check that you factored correctly by distributing. So we can take this 2x times x minus 5 times x plus 3 and distribute it out and see if we get what we started with. Now you have a couple choices here. You can take this 2x and distribute it to the first group and then distribute the 2 groups together, which a lot of you will refer to as FOIL. Or you can take these 2 groups, distribute them out together, which a lot of you call FOIL, and then distribute the 2x. So what I'll do is I'll take this 2x and distribute it to the first group. 2x times x is 2x squared. 2x times negative 5 is negative 10x. And so now I will take and distribute these 2 groups. So everybody in the first group needs to get multiplied to everybody in the second group. So I will take this 2x squared times x to get 2x cubed. This 2x squared times 3 to get 6x squared. Take this negative 10x times x to get negative 10x squared. Negative 10x times 3 to get negative 30x. Combine my like terms right here, and I get 2x cubed minus 4x squared minus 30x. Notice this is what we started with, so we did factor completely. Let's try another one. 3x cubed plus 5x squared minus 12x minus 20. So we look at this. First thing we want to do is factor out the greatest common factor. Do they all have anything in common? No. So there is no greatest common factor. So now we'll just go to our regular methods of factoring. Now we notice that there's 4 terms, so we're going to try to factor by grouping. So we'll group the first 2 together and we'll group the second 2 together. Just remember, in front of the 2 groups has to be a plus sign. So instead of subtracting, I will have to change that to adding a negative, right? Because adding a negative is the same as subtracting. And then I can group the first 2 together and group the second 2 together. And so now in here, is there anything that they both have in common? An x squared. In here, is there something that they both have in common? Now, a lot of you might be saying 4, but notice they're both negative, and typically we want this value right here to be positive in general, so I'll pull out a negative 4. So when I pull out an x squared, I'm left with 3x plus 5. When I pull out that negative 4, I'm left with 3x plus 5. So notice these 2 terms have a 3x plus 5 in common. So I can pull a 3x plus 5 from both of them, and when I do, I'm left with that x squared minus 4. Now, 3x plus 5 is not the difference of 2 perfect squares. It's not a trinomial. You can't factor by grouping. But this x squared minus 4 is the difference of 2 perfect squares. So we'll bring this 3x plus 5 down with us, and we can factor this x squared minus 4 further into x plus 2 times x minus 2. And we've now factored completely. Let's look at another example. 2x to the 5th minus 32x. Again, the first thing you want to do is factor out anything that they both have in common. So if you notice, they're both divisible by 2x, so when I pull out a 2x, I'm left with x to the 4th minus 16. So that's not 4 terms. I'm not going to try grouping. It's not 3 terms. I'm not going to try trinomial. But it is two terms. Is it the difference of two perfect squares? Is x to the fourth a perfect square? It is. It's x squared times x squared. Is 16 a perfect square? It is. It's 4 times 4. And is this a difference? Yes. So this can factor further into 2x times x squared plus 4 times x squared minus 4. Now, 2x can't factor that any further. X squared plus 4. It is two terms. It is the sum of two perfect squares, but the only formula we have for factoring is the difference of two perfect squares. So this cannot be factored further. But this x squared minus 4 can. That can factor into x plus 2 times x minus 2. And we have now factored it completely. And at any time when you're practicing, if you want to look at what you factored and make sure you factored it completely, that you did it correctly, you can always distribute everything back and make sure you get what we started with. Let's look at 12x cubed minus 30x squared minus 18x. Again, first thing you want to do is definitely factor out the greatest common factor. They all have a 2x in common, so they all have a 6x in common, so I will pull out a 6x. And when I do, I'm left with 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. So now I'm going to need to factor that. There are lots of different methods of factoring trinomials. There's all sorts of methods, and you can search online and look at YouTube videos other than mine. You can do Khan Academy. You can do all sorts of resources. But the method we discussed was to break it up into 4 terms and factor by grouping. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. And we're going to take the a, this is b and this is c, and we're going to take the a times c and multiply it together to get negative 6. And so now we want to find two numbers that multiply to get negative 6 that add to b, which is negative 5. And those numbers are going to be negative 6 and positive 1. So then I'm going to rewrite this as 2x squared minus 6x plus 1x minus 3. And now that I have it in 4 terms, I'm going to try to factor that by grouping. So I'll group these first two together and these second two together. 2x squared minus 6x. That has a 2x in common, and I'm left with x minus 3. Here, they don't have anything in common, but they always have something in common that's a 1. So you have to pull out something. There has to be a filler here. In this case, it's going to be 1. And so now what do these two terms have in common? An x minus 3. And when I factor out that x minus 3, I'm left with that 2x plus 1. So coming back up here to this 2x squared minus 5x minus 3, this factors into x minus 3 times 2x plus 1, and so fully factored we have 6x times x minus 3 times 2x plus 1, and neither of these will factor any further. That's it for now. See you next time.